one note, what he said is absolutely true. The more you read, the better you become at speaking, writing, and even listening. She spoke English fluently, but with a very thick Russian accent. Sweet, nice, but ultimately she was not happy about it. You don't like your language tandem, you don't like your teacher, whatever, you should find the courage to drop them. Okay, confession time. If there's one method I keep coming back to across all of the 14 plus languages I've learned, it's reading. But not just any reading. It has to be the kind that is fun, immersive, and that actually sticks. Today, we're reacting to a video by a fellow language nerd, Till, who's diving into the power of extensive reading. And he's got research to back it up. The 98% rule, graded readers, guilty-free language exposure. We're unpacking all of it. And oh, yes, he said it. Stop obsessing over flashcards. As someone who's helped thousands of learners, and honestly, as someone who spent more hours reading in foreign languages than I care to admit, I want to break this video down and highlight what really works and where you should be cautious. So whether you're just starting out, you've been stuck at B1 for years, or you've reached B2, but you still want more, buckle up. This one is for you. There's a lot to love here, especially that elusive 98% comprehensive rule.
The best way to improve your knowledge of a foreign language is to go and live among its speakers. The next best way is read extensively in it. That's what Christine Nuttall wrote back in 1996, and decades of research have proven her right. But what exactly is extensive reading, and why is it so effective? We look at the science behind it, explore the sweet spot rule that tells you exactly what level you should be reading at, discover the virtuous cycle that makes reading not just effective but actually enjoyable over time, and learn about Zipf's law, which should help you choose your material.
Sounds pretty exciting. The only one observation that I wanted to make about the quote at the beginning is the fact that yes, you have to spend time with native speakers. That's the best possible environment. And yes, you have to read extensively if you want to reach the upper echelons of language learning, so to speak. But before you get to that, you have to put in a lot of work, and we're probably going to have the chance of talking about it in the video.
What are common pitfalls, and how can we implement practical strategies to make use of the best language learning method available to us? As Stephen Krashen, one of the most influential researchers in language acquisition, puts it, free voluntary reading may be the most powerful tool we have in language education. In fact, it appears too good to be true.
I agree 100%, and it's actually a shame that less and less or fewer and fewer people are reading, because reading is essential not just for developing yourself as a person, but also when it comes to language learning. If you want to get to a very good level, I'm not just talking about B2, but also C1 and C2, I think that reading is actually essential. So on the one hand, it's a little bit sad that fewer and fewer people are reading, but for those who read, I guess you guys and girls know that reading is not only great, but it's also very, very, very efficient for language acquisition.
Let's start by understanding what extensive reading actually is, and more importantly, what it isn't. When we talk about reading in language learning, there are 3 different levels we need to understand. The extensive reading foundation breaks it down like this. First, there's what they call reading pain. That's when you understand less than 90% of the words. At this stage, you are constantly reaching for the dictionary, you might get frustrated, and you are barely able to follow the story. If you're a beginner in a language, sometimes all the material can feel exactly like that. Then there's intensive reading.
Before we talk about intensive reading, I agree that at the beginning, it's kind of painful to go through a text and when it comes to reading, because you don't know pretty much anything in the language. So it's not just vocabulary, it's also the grammar structures, etc., etc. But I would not call that reading pain. It's more like intensive reading, which he's describing right now, but at a very low level. This is when, for example, you're starting again to learn a language and you're using language learning materials like Assimil or Teach Yourself that try to facilitate the process of dissecting a text in your target language, because either you have a vocabulary list or maybe you have a bilingual transcript that allows you to compare the two languages, and maybe some grammar notes that clarify the most obscure points, so to speak.
That's when you understand between 90 and 98% of the words. This is your typical textbook reading when you're exposed to new words, maybe you're even taking notes, and you're sort of actively studying the language. Here again, you might be opening the translator or dictionary frequently. It's useful, intensive reading is definitely useful, but it's not what we're talking about today.
Now, before we move on to what he's going to talk about today, which I guess is extensive reading, I wanted to say that at this point, this is another phase of intensive reading. And normally I use, for example, transcripts of podcasts, and I use videos with subtitles and transcriptions. This is my level of intensive reading, let's say between A2 and B2 before I started reading books. And it's intensive. It's true. You have to sit down, you have to pay attention, you have to use translators, whether you use DeepL or you use ChatGPT or you use Google Translate. You can help yourself with these amazing tools nowadays that you have in order to dissect the text that you're reading, whether it's a video, it's a podcast, it's even a novel. The only thing is it's intensive reading. Once again, you have to sit down, whether you're using audio or not. You have to sit down, you have to use translation, or you have to use other means in order to dissect the text. It's slow. And you have to go through the text, and there's a lot of words that you don't understand. Now, you might say, well, it's 90%. What if I understand 90% of the text? Yeah, but 90% means that there's still 10% of the text that you do not understand, and that is actually quite a lot, because if you miss a word, you might actually miss the entire meaning of the sentence. So it's a lot of work. Until you get to a certain threshold, it's a lot of work, and that's why they call it intensive reading. But I call both painful reading and intensive reading, it's just two different phases of intensive reading. That is where you still do not read comfortably.
What we're interested in is extensive reading. According to the Extensive Reading Foundation, that means understanding 98% or more of the words. That means you encounter only 2 to 4 new words per page. And this seems to be where the magic happens. The READ acronym gives us a good guideline. Read quickly and enjoyably with adequate comprehension, so you don't need a dictionary. This does.
Agreed 100%. When you get to 90% of understanding, you can actually engage in extensive reading, which is pretty pleasurable. So if you don't know 2 to 4 words or expressions or phrases, it's pleasurable. It's nice to read. But if you know less than that, it's more difficult, and you have to resort to vocabulary more often, or you have to use, Google Lens, for example. That's what I do. I've been doing, when it comes to reading a novel in Polish, I'm still between intensive and extensive, let's put it that way. But I still need some sort of translation tool in order to read. And unfortunately, I'm not reading extensively. I have to stop every page. I have to scan it. I have to see the meaning of the entire page and then read through it.
This does, however, sound a little counterintuitive. Aren't we supposed to challenge ourselves with harder materials? Well, that's exactly what makes extensive reading to be too good to be true. There are countless studies that show all kinds of benefits, and we will quickly go through them next. Think about how you learned your native language. You didn't start by reading Shakespeare. You started with very simple stories, gradually building up your understanding. The same principle applies here. When you read material at your level, you're seeing vocabulary and grammar patterns in their natural context, over and over again. This repetition is crucial. Each time you encounter a word or pattern in different contexts, your brain strengthens its understanding. This is way more effective than memorizing word lists, and it happens subconsciously, which makes the whole prospect of extensive reading so appealing.
I agree 100%, but you have to get there. Once again, the problem is actually getting to a point where you can comfortably read any page of a book. Once you get there, the more the merrier, because the more you read, the more you like it, the more words you learn, the easier it gets to read. But again, it takes at least 2 or 3 years of hard work, meaning intensive work, before you can get to that point.
You're not actively studying. You're just reading what you enjoy. So here it is. Reading improves your reading skills. Thank you for watching. All right, that's not shocking news.
Before we continue, another thing. It took me around 2 years to get to that level in English, 2 years to get to the level in French, 2 or 3 years to get to the level in, for example, in German. So it takes at least a couple of years to get to the level. You have to do a lot of intensive reading. And once you get to the level, once you get to the point where you start reading a book, that's a moment that, it will kind of make or break your reading habits, because the first time that you read a novel or you read a nonfiction book, it's kind of a shock. You think, oh, I've been learning this language for 2 years. I must nail this thing. And then you realize that you find it really difficult to read a book. But again, the first time is a shock. Then the second time is a little bit easier, etc., etc. So do not despair.
What's more interesting is that it enhances almost every aspect of language learning. Similar to the vocabulary exposure, your grammar improves because you're constantly seeing correct patterns that your brain picks up on. That way your writing gets better because you're internalizing how sentences are structured and what vocabulary to use in what context. But even your listening and, yes, speaking can improve from reading extensively through something called subvocalization. Ever notice?
Before we talk about that, one note. What he said is absolutely true. The more you read, the better you get. You become at speaking, writing, and even listening, because it all goes in the back of your head, and it's all language acquisition. Now, this reminds me also of something that my Polish trainer Gosia told me one day. She had a student who really struggled with writing in Polish, and then a year later they met again, and her writing was amazing. And Gosia asked her student, why? What happened? And she said, I started reading massively. So just a note that this is actually true.
Notice that little voice in your head? Sometimes it can be annoying as hell, but when you read, it's at least focused on the text in front of you, hopefully. That's subvocalization. You're actually practicing pronunciation in your mind as you read. I've had this experience countless times where I used a phrase in English that I've never consciously studied. They just come naturally from all the reading I've done, since I've been reading pretty much only English books for the past 10 years or so. I'm currently in the process of switching everything from English to Spanish, following all the guidelines that I talk about in this video. Now, the sweet spot.
This is very true. When you read, you subvocalize. This is what normally happens to all of us. And one interesting note is that back in the day, in ancient times, people never read silently. They always read it out loud. It was a rule. There's a lot of historical reasons, but that was supposed to be the rule. And so that's actually true that you subvocalize. Now, one important thing is that when you start learning a language, I prefer listening and reading at the same time all the time until I reach at least a B1 level and B2 level. And that's why I use language learning materials for beginners and then podcasts and videos, as I said before, because by listening and reading, you're not subvocalizing. You're just forced to actually listen and read at the same time to create a map between the sound and the writing structure of the language. And if you do not do that, and if you just start reading in your target language without listening, then you develop a lot of bad patterns because the phonetic rules of your own native language carry over your target language. This is what happened, for example, with Dina, the organizer of a conference in Moscow that I met, and she spoke English fluently, but with a very thick Russian accent. Sweet, nice, but ultimately she was not happy about it. So,
But rule suggests that you should know 98% of the words when reading extensively. But from my experience, this rule is definitely a little bendable. I find 90 to 95% completely reasonable. Even when I encounter unknown words, I just often keep reading and completely ignore the fact that I don't understand said word, and therefore maybe not even understand the meaning of the sentence. However, that word will probably appear again, and then again and again, in different contexts, and eventually I will understand it. And if it doesn't appear again, well then maybe it wasn't that important for understanding the story anyway. So in my opinion, words...
Agreed 100%. 98 is just a number, 98%. Then it really depends on the situation and depends on the book. Maybe it's a book you're familiar with and maybe you understand 92% of the word and all the words and you're still comfortable with it. So really you have to see what works for you in general. We have rules of thumb and then we have the different and specific situation we have to adapt to. I do the same. For me, 90 to 95% of words, reading a page where I understand 95% of the words is completely reasonable. I use dictionaries. I use Google Lens to scan the page and it's totally fine.
Words don't have to click on the first encounter. There's also another practical reason why I'm not so strict about this 98% rule. And that is finding material that exactly hits this sweet spot can be very challenging, especially as a beginner. If you don't have a basic vocabulary foundation, extensive reading can feel somewhat impossible. The rule and extensive reading in general becomes more and more important the more you progress in your language learning journey. So if you're a complete beginner,
absolutely correct. And I would argue that it's almost pointless to look for text where you understand 98% of the words, because as you're a beginner, this is not bound to happen. You have to actually walk your way, make your way until the point where you can read extensively. So I think it's pointless to find materials that you can understand 98% or, at a very high percentage. You can work through intensive reading. This is what I've been doing. And I found a lot of, there's a debate whether you should just consume content that you understand from the very beginning, comprehensible content that is available and is possible. But I just say, let's use, translation tools in order to dissect a text that you don't understand. There is no problem with that. It all depends. It all boils down to how you use translation. Translation is just a tool to facilitate the understanding of any text.
Beginner, there are better ways to start. Comprehensible input videos have two major advantages over reading when you're a beginner. First, the visual element makes content more easily understandable, even if you are far from the 98% vocabulary mark. You can grasp what's happening through context, gestures, and visual cues. Second, and this is crucial, you're listening to the language. Starting with listening can improve your pronunciation later on, because you develop an ear for how the language sounds. If you jump straight into reading, you might fall into the trap of doing subvocalization for everything you read in your native language's sound system, and therefore you might develop some bad pronunciation habits that are harder to fix later on.
This is exactly what I said. What I said before. And as far as consuming content, for example, like videos where the person shows things that you can understand. Let's suppose that, for example, I don't know, I'm speaking in German. This is Kopf, Hand, zwei Hände. So this is relatively easy to understand, but there's more to it than meets the eye, as they say. So to me, it's difficult to find language content that you can understand immediately. You can find it. There's a lot of videos on YouTube in Spanish and German, etc. They're great. I think that's the ideal material, but it's very slow. So learning this way is really slow, and using translation is way faster. Actually, you can use a combination of the two because one thing does not exclude the other.
So subvocalization can kind of be amazing or a curse, depending on your level. You can circumvent that with books that you own both in written form as well as the audio version. That way you can listen and read at the same time or switch between the two. So maybe listen to one chapter first and then read it again later on in the day. So as you progress, I advise you to incorporate more and more reading. Another tip here is that comics, graphic novels and manga are great for this transition period. I read several volumes of One Piece in Spanish and it was noticeably easier than regular books because the images provided so much context. This made inferring word meanings much more natural and easier, and most importantly, it was just enjoyable. I
agree. I used some comics, Donald Duck, for example, and Mickey Mouse. I was reading those in French and in German back in the day, and I found them great because you can see you got visuals too, so they help before you jump into reading novels, literature, and nonfiction books.
Can't stress this often enough. The best technique to learn a language is the one you actually do consistently and with joy, so that motivation becomes irrelevant.
I love it. Motivation becomes relevant when you do something you enjoy. This has been my mantra for over 30 years. I love language learning. I do it every single day because I find it rewarding. So I don't need any motivation. I just feel like, hey, I've got to sit down and I'm just going to hit those books and I'm going to love it.
Compelling input appears to eliminate the need for motivation, a conscious desire to improve. When you get compelling input, you acquire whether you are interested in improving or not. For both the lower intermediate and upper intermediate level, you can use graded readers, which are books adapted to your level. And once you reach an advanced level, particularly if you're aiming to move from B2 to C1, to me, reading becomes almost non-negotiable. But at the same time, at this point, you also have access to so much more material.
So it's true that graded readers are great. I have a few in Chinese and other languages. And if you find novels, nonfiction books, etc. daunting, well, give it a try. You can simply type graded readers on Amazon or wherever you want, and then you can find a bunch, depending on the language, of course.
This brings us to the virtuous cycle of reading, a powerful feedback loop that makes the whole process self-sustaining. It works like this. The more you read, the better you understand. When you understand better, you can read faster. Reading faster makes the experience generally more enjoyable because you don't need to look up so much, which makes you want to read more. And so the cycle continues.
Yeah, that's been my case for the 6 languages that I know best. Italian is my native language, of course, but this goes for Italian as well, because even if I'm an Italian native speaker, this doesn't necessarily mean that I'm well-read or well-spoken for that matter. So I started with Italian, then English, French, German, Spanish, and Russian. These are languages where I really like reading. I read extensively because, with time, I got better and better, and I enjoy it more and more.
It's really that simple. There is no crazy magic happening here. Each time you encounter a word again, you are closer to mastering it forever. The more you read, the more words you encounter and repeat naturally. This is why I built these exact principles into Lengia, my language learning app. The whole progress tracking and spaced repetition system is built on that fact. Whether you're reading the daily stories that match your interests and level, discovering new articles across the web, or uploading your own books, Lengia helps you simplify and translate everything to your level. You can track your progress, create quick flashcards, and maintain that immersive reading flow without constantly switching between different apps and dictionaries. But to keep this virtuous...
Yeah, this is great. This is another app like similar to LingQ, for example, by Steve Kaufman, does something similar that facilitates the process of reading. So anything that you like, this looks great. I like the colors too. Link or any other app that facilitates the process of understanding text and allows you to then get to the point where you can do extensive reading is fair game.
Cycle going, there are some common pitfalls that we should avoid. I said that the sweet spot rule is bendable, but that doesn't change the fact that the biggest pitfall is choosing material that's too difficult. It's clearly the fastest way to break this virtuous circle, because if you're constantly struggling, reading becomes more of a chore than something enjoyable. Another common mistake is the dictionary trap. Even if the material is a bit harder than ideal, often it's better to keep reading and ignore words you don't understand. Remember, context is your friend, and words that matter will show up again. Checking the dictionary will just get you out of the flow of reading and immersion. If you want to do it, at least use a digital reading device like a Kindle or read on Lengia so you can check words quickly. I would recommend...
Yeah, I agree with this. I think that checking up every single word is a recipe for disaster when it comes to reading because it disrupts the flow of reading, the pleasure of reading. What I normally do is I read a page or read an entire chapter and then I look up words later. I don't normally use apps in order to read because I don't like looking at the screen. I try to stay away from the screen because I spend too much time in front of the computer already. So I read normal books or a Kindle or paper books, and I use Google Lens to then scan the page and have it speak it. Now it's going to read it out loud in my own native language so that I can immediately understand the meaning of the entire page. I find it fun, rewarding, and so that's why I do it. But you can do whatever floats your boat, as they say.
I recommend these digital tools anyway, because you can have hundreds of books with you, and the progress indicator is always a nice little bit of extra motivation, especially when you're just starting out. Like I said, motivation should be a non-factor once that virtuous cycle kicks in. Goodreads is one more resource I can recommend for finding new books and tracking your progress. The question what to read can also be answered by the perspective of Zipf's law. Zipf's law shows us that in any language, a small number of words make up the majority of what we actually use and read. The most common word in English, usually the, appears about twice as often as the second most common word, 3 times as often as the third most common word, and so on. In fact, just the 100 most frequent words typically make up about 50% of what we read, and the 1000 most frequent words cover roughly 85% of most texts. Why is this important for extensive reading? Once you learn those first 1000 most common words, you can understand the vast majority of any text. Each additional word you learn has less impact than the ones before, but by that point you are already understanding enough to enjoy reading. This also implies a second effect though. Encountering new words and then seeing them often enough gets increasingly more difficult. This leaves us with an interesting choice. Stick to one genre or not to do that.
Very interesting. It is absolutely true. The Zipf's law actually applies to many other fields, not just in linguistics and language learning. But that is the reason why reading books is so important, because we use a lot of these common words, 1,000, 2,000 in everyday conversation. And then we realize that when we venture into books or documentaries and more complex things, we encounter words and expressions we've never encountered before, more and more, which makes reading more difficult. That's the reason why reading a nonfiction novel, or a novel for that matter, is complicated.
If you're into true crime stories, you will likely read several of them. That means you will see similar vocabulary repeated, but that's actually good. It helps reinforce those words. Once you're comfortable, then you can branch out to different genres for more varied vocabulary. If you, on the other hand, stick to the same niche forever, the density of new words will consistently decrease.
It's true. You can read books within the same genre, and that's what I've been doing. For example, I started with fantasy, the Shannara books by Terry Brooks. I don't know if you ever heard of that, if you're a fantasy fan or buff. And then I started reading more and more, fantasy novels, and I understood the kind of jargon in it. And then I moved on to other, like, for example, Stephen King's books. And so genre by genre, book by book, you get, to the level where you're comfortable.
Finally, don't feel guilty about dropping a book that you're not enjoying. Most of us feel like when we start a book, we should finish it and not give up. This is a really bad habit though. The only thing that matters is that you read. If a book doesn't
Agreed, 100%. Just read whatever you like, and if you don't like a book, just drop it.
excite you, just pick a different one immediately.
This, by the way, goes for everything. It goes for, you don't like your boyfriend, drop it. If you don't like your friends, drop them. If you don't like something, just, move on to the next thing. You don't like your language tandem, you don't like your teacher, whatever. You should find the courage to drop them, ditch them and move on to something else.
This is way better than procrastinating your reading because it became a chore. Extensive reading is of course not the only effective language learning method out there, and also not a one-size-fits-all. I am currently using very different approaches for Spanish and Japanese, and if you're curious about how to balance learning multiple languages at once, check out my latest video. I break down my complete strategy there, from managing daily routines to choosing the right resources for each language.
So, yeah, I agree. Reading is just one thing. It's never only one thing. If you speak a language fluently, it's because you've read books, it's because you've talked to people, because you had multiple experiences. But I can guarantee you that once you reach B2 and you want to move to the next stage, C1, C2, and beyond, you have to read massively. You have to read extensively. You have to get to that point. And then, as they say, the rich become richer. All right. So what do I think? Honestly, this is the kind of video I wish more learners would watch. It's research-backed, practical, and it actually respects the learner's experience, not just the theory. If I had to share with you one main lesson that deeply resonated with me, is that reading is maybe the most powerful tool I have ever resorted to when it comes to learning and refining more than 14 languages. Reading what I loved and the languages I was learning. Comics, crime novels, philosophy, magazines, you name it. Anything that made me forget I was even learning. That is what really, really made a difference in the long run. This and more reasons is why Till's video is so powerful. And by the way, if you want to see the original, I left a link in the description box. He's got more awesome stuff about language learning, and you should definitely check his channel. So, if Till's message resonated with you, and if you enjoyed this one reaction, I think you're going to love something I created for you. It's my complete guide on how to read in any foreign language. Totally free. And it walks you through everything from what to read, when to read it, how to read it, and how to make it stick. You will find the link, once again, in the description box or in the pinned comment below. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Till, for the great video. And, as always, happy language learning, and I will see you in the next one.